for the official opposition.
Monsieur le Président, je me lève à la Chambre des communes pour
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to speak about the 23 billion additional dollars of inflationary spending in this bill alone. That's another example of a prime minister who, after 8 years, is just not worth the cost. And when I say that he's just not worth the cost, Mr. Speaker, I will speak about his tactic of false advertising. False advertising is normally an offense that could lead to criminal charges in the private sector. If, for example, a business advertises that they are offering a product for a certain price and that they don't deliver the product, well then, criminal charges could be brought against that company. But governments constantly do that. They ask for money, and they say in exchange for that, they're going to offer a product to Canadians. And we see that all the time with this Prime Minister. For example, we could talk about its so-called program to help the middle class. 8 years later, we see that 9 out of 10 middle-class youth can't find a home and believe that they never will be able to do so. 8 years later, there's an increase in the number of Ontarians who need to go to a food bank, an increase of 46%. And that's among people who are in work. These are middle-class people. These people are suffering. They never needed to go to the food bank before. But 8 years after the government said it would help the middle class, and now they need to go to the food bank. We have a prime minister who would help the media with big subsidies. And what's the result? News articles are being removed from our social networks. The government also said that it would help students, that it would help children with their school lunches. But if we look at the program in the bill, it doesn't actually involve any food. It's just money for the federal minister to consult with another minister, to consult with provincial ministers, to further consult with interest groups in order to finally publish a report, to make a plan, to make a policy, so that one day perhaps some children will get lunch. So this is yet another example of a case where the government says, we'll feed children. But that's actually not true. They're not going to feed children. They're just going to feed their own bureaucracy. Now let's talk about housing. The Prime Minister announced, while criticizing Jean Chrétien for producing bureaucracy in housing at the federal level, he said that the federal government was going to get back into the area, that it was going to have major programs of $47 billion for affordable housing. 8 years later, what do we have? The price of housing has doubled. The cost of the mortgage for an average house has more than doubled, from about $1,400 to $3,500 per month. The cost for a one-bedroom apartment has gone up on average from $900 to nearly $2,000. And the average deposit for a house across the country has gone from about $20,000 to more than $50,000. So the plan was to spend billions and billions of dollars to create affordable homes. And what's the result? Doubling their costs. Exactly the opposite of what the advertising said. Unfortunately, this advertising sometimes shows up in documents we have to vote on in the House of Commons. We have, for example, programs called affordable housing that actually make housing more expensive. And we give millions or billions of dollars to fund these programs. Once again, in the private sector, that would lead the CEO to prison, to ask for money for a product. And then after that, what is actually delivered is the opposite of that product. The CEO would be in prison. But this Prime Minister does that all the time. And yet, he's keeping all of his prerogatives while people are suffering. That is why I created an important documentary on this Prime Minister's housing hell. The media, which are bought by this Prime Minister, flipped out. They flipped out all over the country. But they had an issue. They couldn't find anything wrong with the facts in my documentary. I mentioned around 55 facts. Every 20 seconds in the documentary, on average, there was a new fact. Not a single journalist was able to find a mistake in all those facts. Let me just come back to some of those facts. Because in fact, I often drew these facts from articles from the same media who have attacked me for my documentary. They had often published those facts themselves. That's the problem. They had published information on the housing crisis. And in their articles, they were forgetting which Prime Minister had caused that crisis, who's in power, who's overseen a doubling in prices. So the facts, 9 out of 10 Canadians believe that they'll never be able to buy a house. That's an article published by Shazia Nazir from Milton, Ontario. This is a fact. You can't deny it. And who's the Prime Minister who oversaw this unprecedented phenomenon? Well, it's this Liberal Prime Minister. Secondly, I show that to have a detached home, it costs 66% of the average paycheck just for the monthly payments on that house. A Radio-Canada journalist said that I had made that up. That's information that comes from that comes from a reputable source. It comes from RBC. And if the media were interested in publishing the truth, they would have seen that. 66% of the average paycheck is needed in order to pay for an average payment, monthly payment on the average house in Canada. And Mr. Speaker, the other 34% is going on taxes. So nothing is left. People won't be able to eat, go on holiday, or have any more money to spend on anything. They'll have to spend all the money on their mortgage. That's compared to 40%, actually 39% to be exact, when I was the minister responsible for housing. 39% of the average paycheck was needed so that the average family could buy the average home and pay average costs on that house 8 years ago. So, the percentage of the average salary necessary for a family to be able to pay for their house has gone up by half. This is a record. It was never like that before. A 57-year-old grandmother is having to live in her truck because of this Prime Minister's housing crisis. Refugees are having to live in the street. Because shelters are full and there's no more space for them after 8 years of this Prime Minister. 8 years ago, the average price of a house in Canada was $454,000. And now it's about $700,000 with higher interest rates, which makes monthly payments even worse. The liberals and their media are trying to say that this is a global phenomenon, but that doesn't make sense because other countries aren't going through the same crisis as Canada. According to all international data, it shows that prices have gone up much faster here in Canada than in almost all other countries. In fact, among OECD countries, the cost of housing has exceeded the increase in wages. And this has happened in Canada much faster than in any other country except for one. That means that unaffordability in Canada is the second worst among almost 40 industrialized countries between 2015 and 2023. Exactly the same period as this Prime Minister was in power. We also see that Toronto has the worst housing bubble in the world. So this isn't just a phenomenon that's happening everywhere around the world in big cities. It's unique to Toronto. And Vancouver is in 6th position on that list. These two markets had reasonable prices 10 years ago, according to the same research. Once again, these liberal-controlled media are trying to contradict that fact, but they have failed. We see that homes near the border, well, on the Canadian side, they are sometimes 3 times as expensive as homes on the US side of the border. If this is an international phenomenon, how can we explain that? In general, prices in the US are often 25 or 40% under prices here in Canada, even though they have an 8 times larger population on a smaller area of land. You can buy a chateau in Sweden for a lower price than a 2-bedroom house in Kitchener after 8 years of this Prime Minister. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, of all the countries in the G7, well, we know that we have the most land per person per capita in the G7. And a Radio-Canada journalist tried to save this Prime Minister and said, well, that's ridiculous because we can't live in the north at the same rate, suggesting that the only land we have available for building would be in the north. No, that's ridiculous. Of course it isn't just in the north. There's a really large amount of area and building space around our large cities. If that were really the case, then why are Americans able to provide much lower priced housing, even though a lot of their population is in Chicago, New York, Houston, Los Angeles, and so on, and they're big cities? So their populations are also highly concentrated, and yet homes there are much less expensive than here in Canada after 8 years of Justin Trudeau. So to say that the amount of land we have is not relevant misses the reality that supply and demand will determine prices. Prices should be low in Canada because we have space near our towns. We have land available in the southern part of the country, in the west, and yes, in the north as well, which would be available for building if we could get red tape out of the way. Red tape from all levels of government. And finally, we see that since this government came to power, we have fewer houses per capita than we used to. In fact, we have the lowest per capita rate of homes in the entire G7, even though we have more land to build on. It's amazing that we had more housing per capita 8 years ago when we didn't have these red tape heavy programs that were supposed to make housing more affordable. Isn't that interesting? According to the Prime Minister, this government has spent $87 billion to build affordable housing. And yet somehow we have fewer homes per capita. It's incredible. It's as though you were at a restaurant and you order something and it's awful. It's not what you ordered. The service was terrible. And when you go to pay, they charge you $500. And they tell you, well, clearly dinner was great because it's expensive. That's this Prime Minister's argument. He says that because his programs are expensive, that clearly they're good. He just attacked us for voting against large sums of money for programs because he believes that how much money is spent is the same thing as results. Even though the spending that he's making is actually delivering the opposite of what the program is supposed to deliver. He's criticizing me for not having spent enough on housing. But I delivered affordable homes and apartments when I was minister at a lower cost for taxpayers. That's common sense. Less taxpayer money and lower prices for home buyers or renters. That's value for money, but this Prime Minister doesn't understand that because he's never worked in his life. He inherited his wealth. He has a tax-sheltered trust fund. So it's pretty clear to me that he struggles to understand what value for money is. Mr. Speaker, in 1972, Canada built 232,000 housing units. In 2022, by contrast, Canada built 219,000 housing units. In 1972, there were 22 million Canadians, and now we have 39 millions. The population has nearly doubled, and yet somehow we've built fewer homes. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, after $87 billion in spending, that this government says it's using to build more homes, they're spending more to somehow build less. That's this government's approach. What is the highest cost for building a home, say in Vancouver? What's most expensive when you build a house? Is it the land, the materials, the labor costs? No. The most expensive part is the various fees and the red tape for the government. And yes, there's also red tape from local governments, but it's all funded by the federal government. This Prime Minister is boasting that he sends big checks to local politicians to build bigger bureaucracy to prevent construction, and all in the name of affordable housing.
Province, Monsieur le
In your province, Mr. Speaker, in fact, in Halifax, the housing minister, after totally failing to give people a good quality of life in Halifax, there were 30 homeless tent cities in Halifax. The minister gave some funding to his friend, the Liberal mayor of Halifax, millions. And the minister said that that would speed up home building. Later, we learned what that money will do. The money is being used to hire more public servants. The same public servants in Halifax who are blocking building will grow their ranks. The federal government's money, the Prime Minister's money, is going to them to build bureaucracy. That's why we need common sense action to build homes and not bureaucracy, and that is our approach. People have criticized my documentary, my groundbreaking documentary. People have said that there's no land, that we can't build because there's not enough land in places where people want to live. What about the Squamish, though? They showed just the opposite. In Vancouver, the Squamish are building 6,000 apartments on 10 acres of land. 10 acres of land, 6,000 apartment units. That's incredible. That's 600 units per acre. That's a huge amount. But this wouldn't have been possible if they'd had to follow the orders of Vancouver's bureaucrats. But they don't have to because they are on a reserve. They're on their people's traditional territory. So they don't need permits from local bureaucrats. That's how they were able to build. This just goes to show that we should get rid of bureaucracy in other cases, because if we scrap bureaucracy, we can build huge apartment buildings and in cities, all while building more homes in suburbs, Mr. Speaker. But that's the exact opposite of what the Prime Minister's doing now. I have heard some other excuses. Excuses served up by the Prime Minister's loyal followers. They've said that it's not the Prime Minister's fault that the cost of housing has doubled. They say that it was COVID that drove up home prices. There's a Journal de Montréal commentator who I quite like, who said that COVID has become the new "the dog ate my homework" excuse. COVID should have decreased property prices. Why? Well, during COVID, there was less immigration. The immigration system was basically shut down for 9 or 10 months. And then it was very slowed down for another 9 or 10 months. So the numbers do show that immigration slowed down. There was also a decrease in the number of jobs and a decrease of salaries. And all of these factors usually decrease demand for property. And these aren't just my words. This is not just my opinion. In fact, the federal government's housing agency projected in the spring of 2020 that home prices would drop by 32% because of COVID. They were wrong. But it's easy to understand why they made that prediction, because when you lose jobs, when salaries drop, when there's less immigration, then normally there is less demand, there's lower demand, so the prices are lower. But why did the prices go up then? Why did home prices go up for the 2 years following COVID? Why? Because the central bank printed $600 billion. That money was printed. There's something else. The media said, oh, that's not true. That has nothing to do with it. Well, in my documentary, I showed a chart published by the Bank of Canada. And in the chart, you can see a doubling of purchases of homes by investors. When did that start? It started in the spring of 2020. Just exactly when the Bank of Canada started printing money and buying bonds. Buying bonds from banks and financial institutions, which made our financial system blow up. And all that money was lent to investors with connections to bankers. And they're the ones who contributed to doubling amounts invested, which led to a 50% increase in prices after that massive infusion of newly printed money into the system. it wasn't COVID that caused the sudden increase in housing prices. It was the printing of money that caused that sudden increase. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals and those who defend them in the media, they like to say that all government spending during COVID was necessary during COVID because of COVID. Is that so? Well, there was a $100 billion deficit before the first case of COVID occurred. According to the PBO, 40% of spending during COVID had nothing to do with COVID. That is, 40% of new added spending during COVID had nothing to do with COVID. COVID's been over for a year or two now, but there are still deficits. We can't still blame COVID. COVID didn't eat their homework, Mr. Speaker, because there were deficits before COVID. There were deficits during COVID, which were not primarily due to COVID. And after COVID, there are still deficits, higher and higher deficits, which go well beyond COVID. COVID is getting further and further in the rearview mirror, yet deficits are still increasing. So we cannot accept the Prime Minister's self-defense that the dog ate his homework. Mr. Speaker, it was an irresponsible decision. I warned against it at the time. I warned that it was irresponsible to print money and to spend recklessly. And this is ongoing, and it makes interest prices rise. Each time the Prime Minister rises in the House of Commons and says that he had no choice but to spend, he had no choice but to spend on all sorts of slogans. But when you look at the results behind the slogans, it's in fact false publicity because the results don't match what's promised. And that's why we often vote against the spending, which on its face, with a slogan, might seem great, but in reality, the spending does the opposite of what it's supposed to do, of the opposite of what the government promises. That's why we need a common-sense government, Mr. Speaker, and that is what I will deliver as Canada's future Prime Minister. The Bloc Québécois asked me, what is common sense? I admire their humility because when they asked me that, they admitted that they don't have a clue what common sense is. So I was able to help them out. I was able to define common sense. They, though, said that common sense is a strange idea because the Bloc Québécois lives in a sort of utopia in the clouds. They are in the House of Commons to make life worse for people and to argue that Canada should be divided and cut up in pieces. Now, what is common sense? I will define it again to help the Bloc Québécois. What is common sense? First, we need to bring prices down. How? By cutting the carbon tax, which is driving up the price of everything. I know that the government wants to quadruple the carbon tax on farmers who produce food, on gas, on all of our industry, and I know that the Bloc Québécois wants to drastically increase the carbon tax. There's a second carbon tax. It's called the Clean Fuel Regulation. But the Bloc isn't satisfied with that. No, it wants to drastically increase carbon taxes and prices. Only the Conservatives will axe the carbon tax to decrease energy payments for all Canadians. We will use technology to fight climate change. I know that the Bloc is against technology. The Bloc is against nuclear energy, for example. Nuclear energy that France is using to offer zero-emission electricity. But the Bloc Québécois is ideologically against that. They are radically ideologically against nuclear energy and other non-emitting energy sources. But we will use that technology instead of taxing F-150s in Saguenay or in Trois-Rivières or truckers and farmers who need their trucks to work. These are good people, Mr. Speaker, good, hardworking people, and we are the only people defending Quebec's regions.
Autre chose qui est le gros bon sens, c'est de contrôler les dépenses.
Also, another element of common sense is controlling spending. The Bloc Québécois always wants bigger federal government. They say on the one hand that they want to get rid of the federal government, but then on the other hand, they always vote to increase the cost of the federal government on the backs of Quebecers. They have voted in favor of all of the spending that the Liberal government has proposed. They have voted against the fiscal discipline that we are proposing. My ideas are based on common sense. Spend a dollar, save a dollar. If you increase spending by $1 somewhere, then you need to cut a dollar of spending elsewhere. This policy existed under Clinton in the 90s, and it allowed the Democrat president to balance the books and to pay down $400 billion in debt, which led to higher salaries, lower cost of living, all sorts of other positive consequences. But after that, Americans fell into deficit, and they have been in deficit since then, and they still are today. It shows that politicians need a legal limit to control their spending, and that's what we will do. We will do it like single parents do, like small businesses do, like families do. When a common-sense Canadian increases spending somewhere in their budget, they cut spending somewhere else in the budget. That will be our policy. That is how we will bring about fiscal discipline. We will also cut waste. For example, the infrastructure bank, the $35 billion infrastructure bank, which has not delivered any infrastructure projects, not a single one. We're going to get rid of the ArriveCan app. And also, money is being given to China to build pipelines in China, pipelines that we block here in Canada. That makes no sense, Mr. Speaker. We're not here to build up the Chinese empire. We're here to build a good life for Canadians in Canada. Now, common sense. Common sense means telling municipalities that if you want infrastructure money, you need to build more. You need to be permitting more. The reason we don't have enough homes is because there's too much bureaucracy blocking homes. We're, in fact, the second slowest OECD country when it comes to granting permits. So we need to incentivize municipalities. How will we do so? Well, we will tell municipalities that the amounts that they receive for infrastructure in the future will be directly tied to the amount of homes that they build, that they allow to be built, that they grant permits for. So it will be results-based funding. I will ensure that all municipalities have a 15% increase in home building, and if they do so, then they will receive a bonus. But if they're under that 15%, their funding will be cut. City bureaucrats will be paid the way real estate agents are paid, by volume of sales. So municipal bureaucrats will be paid by the federal government based on the amount of construction that they allow. For example, public transit stations. We are going to ensure that all public transit stations are surrounded by apartments, and then money and funding will be delivered once apartments are built and being lived in. There are 6,000 federal buildings, and there are thousands of acres of federal land, and we will use them to build new homes. We will also ensure that the federal housing agency that gives funding for apartments, we will make it so they do so in 2 months instead of 2 years. And if they don't, then their execs will be fired. It's that simple. In my government, if executives don't deliver, if executives don't perform, they'll be fired. That's how the real world works. That's how it is in big business. That's how it is for mechanics. And that's how it will be in my common sense government. Finally, we will speed up construction. We will speed up building after 8 years during which people have been unable to build and buy homes. Next aspect of our common sense plan, reoffenders. Well, we're going to keep reoffenders behind bars rather than allowing them to commit the same crimes against Canadians over and over and over again. Now, we understand that people may make a mistake once in a while. That's the reality. But we won't allow people to commit 40, 50, 60 violent crimes, one after the other, and then put them back on the streets as the Bloc and the Liberals want to do. We don't want bail for reoffenders, violent reoffenders. We will also offer treatment to those who have drug addiction problems. Our government will also stop going after sport shooters and hunters. The Liberals banned hunting weapons. The Liberals published 300 pages worth of hunting rifles that they wanted to ban. And when they did that, and this is on video, there's video footage of it, the Bloc was here. The Bloc was here, you can see it in the video. And the Bloc was thrilled to see 300 pages worth of hunting rifles banned. But, you know, in Quebec's regions, Bloc MPs, they realized that people in regions hunt. And that was an aha moment for them because they spend all their time in the Plateau and Montreal. They didn't know that there are hunters in Quebec. They figured it out. So just like the Prime Minister, faced with pressure by the Conservative Party, the Bloc Québécois had to walk back their stance. Oops, after all, we're not going to try to ban your hunting rifles because of the great arguments made by the Conservative Party, and that's common sense, Mr. Speaker. We know that this radical coalition will once again try to harm the hunters. So people in Quebec's regions need to depend on the Conservative Party to defend their traditions that have existed for thousands of years here in Canada, Indigenous traditions. I would like to thank First Nations for having stood up for their right to hunt. They did so by opposing the Prime Minister's plan to ban their hunting weapons, Mr. Speaker. We are the only party which believes that we need to invest more and spend more to strengthen our borders to defend against incoming illegal weapons. We're also going to put real criminals in prison, all while supporting sports shooters and hunters. That's common sense. And our Bloc Québécois friends, they think common sense is really strange. They don't really get it, but we are the common sense party, and we will protect freedoms. In fact, the Conservative Party is the only one that voted against a bill. The Bloc Québécois wanted to vote to ban Quebecers from watching certain things online. Can you imagine that? A sovereigntist party wants a woke agency in Ottawa to be able to dictate what Quebecers see and do on the internet. Mr. Speaker, we will not stand for that. We would never accept that. The Conservative Party is the only party that stands up for freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and that's why we will scrap C11.
Liberté d'expression.
We need freedom of expression. We need national freedom, and that is why the Conservative Party will rebuild our military. After this Prime Minister has wasted so much money with incompetent procurement, including the F-35 file, among other things, we'll put an end to the waste. We will spend our money to help our soldiers and to rebuild our military. We'll stop giving money to dictatorships and to bureaucracy. We're going to bring the money back here to Canada to rebuild our armed forces. We're going to defend our freedom by defending our military, Mr. Speaker. In conclusion, I know that for most Canadians, these are tough times. Everything's broken. And this is not just my opinion. 2/3 of Canadians surveyed feel the same way. But we have a Prime Minister who keeps wanting to promote negativity. He's always negative, and he wants to divide people. I am here with a positive message. I am here with a common sense message that gives hope to Canadians all across the country. That, yes, the future will be better than today, the times we're going through now. Yes, we can have a country where people are free to earn fat paychecks and to buy food, groceries, and affordable houses in safe communities. That's the goal of the Conservative Party, and that is the goal in bringing common sense back here, bringing it home. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Now in English. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. I can only go where my caucus leads, and they're asking me to continue speaking, Mr. Speaker. Or I can do no other. I'm but their humble servant, Mr. Speaker. And so that's Mr. Speaker. The member across the way is also very humble, and he has much to be humble about indeed, Mr. Speaker, as does his entire government. Mr. Speaker, today I rise to speak about false liberal advertising. What we have in the private sector are laws that could lead to the criminal prosecution of any business that advertises one thing and delivers the opposite. Yep. If somebody goes on television and tries to sell a product and then fails to deliver it after collecting payment, they can be sued civilly. That's right. And maybe even charged criminally. But weirdly, in politics, we call it lawmaking. We have a Prime Minister who literally brings programs before the House of Commons that do exactly the opposite of what they say. Yep. So, for example, he says that he's going to spend these millions of dollars buying back hunting rifles. What has this resulted in? 100% increase in violent crime. Yeah. He has a program that he says will help protect the media that has actually removed the media from social networks. He is a Prime Minister, we have a Prime Minister who has an $87 billion affordable housing program that has doubled the cost of housing. This is the exact opposite of what he promised, and yet he took billions of dollars from Canadians in order to pay for it. He has, for example, they were busy trumpeting their idea of a affordable food program for kids, and then we found out that there's no food in the program. Exactly. We found out what the program does. It doesn't provide a single dollar for food. Here's what it does, and I've got it right from the bill. The minister must, in consultation with the Minister of Health, representatives of the provincial governments responsible for health and education, other relevant stakeholders in the fields, and representatives of Indigenous governing bodies, develop a national framework to establish a school food program. So let's just walk through all the steps. Because we know that normally in the real world, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, but there were many points that were unrelated to kids actually having food in their bellies. One, that one minister would consult with another federal minister, who will consult with provincial ministers, who will consult with stakeholders, which is code for lobbyists, who will then develop a national framework to establish a school food program. So I note that the bill actually didn't provide a single dollar to source anything of nutritional value. Not a single calorie of nutrition is funded by the bill. So it doesn't feed kids, it feeds bureaucracy.
That's right.
This is an example of all of the wonderful labels and slogans they put on their spending that actually doesn't deliver anything to the end user.
That's right.
It is more self-service, not public service, self-service of the bigger and fatter bureaucracy and the ecosystem of lobbyists, interest groups, researchers, bureaucrats, crown CEOs, contractors, who feast off of all the money that is hidden under these beautiful and unimpeachable slogans. You know, the beautiful "Let's Protect Innocent Kittens" Act. Well, we'll spend $1 billion on that, but we'll hire a bureaucrat who will create a department that will consult with paid interest groups, who will contract out their report writing to those who have expertise in PowerPoints, and we'll have hundreds of people feeding off of this program, and the poor little kittens will be forgotten about at the end. The kittens, Mr. Speaker.
The kittens.
Who thinks of the kittens? They don't actually get anything.
That's right.
Not even a little bit of milk, Mr. Speaker, because they'll carbon tax that as well. But that is the system that we have in this government. They spend more to achieve less. As I said, an $87 billion housing program that is supposed to make housing affordable, which has doubled the cost of housing. Doubled the rent, doubled the mortgage payment, doubled the needed down payment. Let's go through the numbers. When I was housing minister, the average rent for one bedroom was about $950. Now it's just under $2,000. Wow. The average mortgage payment on an average home, newly purchased, was $1,400. Today it's $3,500. The average down payment for a newly purchased, standard priced home was $20,000. Can you imagine that?
No.
You can't imagine it now. It almost seems quaint. $20,000 for a down payment. That was only 8 years ago. And now it's over $50,000. Now, the Prime Minister's main criticism of me is that I didn't have big enough bureaucracies at the same time as I was making housing affordable. So his measurement of success is that not whether or not you deliver an end product to the end user, it's whether or not you build a big enough bureaucracy and line item in the budget to pay for it. Failing is bad, failing expensively is worse, Mr. Speaker. Boy, has he ever failed. I recently produced a documentary called Housing Hell, How We Got In and How We'll Get Out. Has anybody heard of it? I see some backbench liberals, some random liberals in the backbench over there have even heard of it, and it's nice because they don't really get put to any good use. It's good that they were able to have a quiet 15 minutes to soak in this production. Well, maybe I'll make a few more and it will add up to an hour, and then the member will have something to do with himself when he's away on Christmas break. Maybe that will be the Christmas gift that appears under that member's tree when he wakes up and opens his phone, Mr. Speaker. Now, we have seen an absolute meltdown by the bought and paid for media. First of all, they were furious that I went around them. How dare I communicate directly with Canadians, they said. And so they proceeded with no success to try and poke holes in it. You see, the documentary introduces roughly a new fact every 20 or 25 seconds, and for the entire 15-minute period. And the media was desperate to find an error or a problem, and they couldn't find a single factual error in the entire documentary. They tried, but let me review some of these undisputable facts because they're all publicly sourced with proof to show where they come from. For example, 9 out of 10 Canadians believe they will never be able to afford a home, a survey shows. That is a headline right out of the Milton Reporter on April 25th, 2022. It's so much worse now than it was back then. This headline from the Globe and Mail: this 57-year-old grandmother didn't choose the van life. The housing crisis chose it for her. That was May of 2023. Imagine the miserable life for this wonderful grandmother after 8 years of this Prime Minister. Then we have that dorm students students are forced to live under bridges. That too was a news headline. You know, you might say, well, why are you quoting the media of which you're critical? Because they fail to mention in any of these articles who is the Prime Minister that presided over this housing hell. They fail to assign blame to the person who actually caused the problem in the first place. And then the Radio-Canada recently desperately flailing around trying to find fault with my documentary said I had no proof that it takes 66% of an average family's monthly income to make payments on the average home. Well, the report comes from RBC in their quarterly housing affordability calculation. They've been doing it for 40 years. And it is now higher than it has ever been in their recorded history. Wow. That's because housing costs have not only grown, but they have vastly outgrown our very poor and miserable wage growth under this Prime Minister. Then they went on to their next excuse, claiming that Canada's housing hell is just part of some global phenomenon. Well, that's an easy claim to dispute and disprove because, of course, our housing hell is so much worse than any other country on earth. For example, Toronto is rated by UBS Bank as the worst housing bubble in the world. Vancouver is the 6th. Both of them were rated as moderately expensive only 10 years ago. If you want a different measure, go to Demographia, which has a very simple formula. They divide the average house price in a country or a city by the average income. And based on that measure, Vancouver is the 3rd and Toronto the 10th most overpriced housing market in the world, worse than Manhattan, Los Angeles, Chicago, London, England, and even Singapore, a country with 2,000 times more people per capita, per square kilometer, than Canada has. And therefore, you cannot say, look at the comparison with the United States. The average American housing prices, depending on the measurement, are 25 to 40% cheaper in border towns. Often, house prices on the Canadian side, 15 minutes away, are double or even triple the cost of south of the border. A 2-bedroom in Kitchener now costs more than a castle in Sweden, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the OECD did a measurement of the growth in house prices relative to the growth in incomes in all of the roughly 40 OECD countries, and Canada saw the 2nd worst deterioration of housing affordability since this Prime Minister took office in 2015. So no, you cannot blame it on some global phenomenon. It is a uniquely Canadian hell, that is a uniquely here and now hell. The Prime Minister is responsible. I find they say, well, the Prime Minister really has nothing to do with housing.
From the honourable member from Elmwood, Transcona.